I never expected to be treated like a trespasser in my own home. Yet, as I stood on my porch, arms crossed, staring at the smug HOA officer demanding my ID, I realized he had no idea who he was dealing with. His self-satisfied smirk told me he thought he had all the power, that he could dictate who was allowed in and out of my house. The arrogance in his stance, the way he leaned ever so slightly forward, as if expecting me to cower and comply, was almost amusing. If only he knew that the man he was challenging wasn't just another homeowner. I wasn't just some powerless resident, bending to the whims of their ridiculous rules. No, I was the new chief of police. And this was about to be the worst mistake of his life. It started a week earlier when I officially moved into the neighborhood. The house was a dream, spacious, secluded enough for peace, yet close enough to the city to stay connected. I had no intention of dealing with HOA nonsense, especially since I knew their reputation for unnecessary power trips. Within days, I had already noticed the overbearing presence of their so-called compliance officers, patrolling the streets like they were running some private security force. The first warning came in the form of a letter taped to my door, not mailed, not slipped under, but aggressively taped as if they wanted to make a statement. It was a notice about unregistered residency, claiming I hadn't formally presented myself to the HOA board. That was my first red flag. I had purchased the home legally, filed all necessary paperwork, and yet, these people thought they had the right to approve whether I could live in my own house. I ignored it. I had no patience for petty power games. But the second encounter made it clear they weren't going to let this go. Stepping outside one morning, I was greeted by two men in HOA uniforms standing at the end of my driveway. One of them, a lanky man with dark sunglasses and an air of self-importance, called out to me. His voice was dripping with authority that didn't belong to him. "Sir, before you proceed any further, we need to verify your identity." That was when I knew this wasn't just standard HOA meddling. This was a full-blown harassment campaign. They were testing me, seeing how much I would tolerate before bending to their authority. I didn't respond. I simply stared, watching their confidence waver under the silence. They expected resistance, maybe even outrage. What they didn't expect was a man trained to handle power-hungry individuals like them every single day. I turned and walked back inside, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. But that was only the beginning. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Notices continued to pile up, each more ridiculous than the last. Failure to comply with HOA registration procedures. Violation of community standards. Unauthorized presence on property. Unauthorized presence? In my own house. It was almost laughable. Almost. Until the night someone tried to enter my property. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard the faintest rustling outside. My instincts kicked in immediately. Years in law enforcement had trained me to notice the smallest disturbances, and this was no stray animal or passing breeze. I moved quickly but quietly, reaching for my phone to check the security cameras. What I saw made my blood boil. Two figures stood at my front gate. One of them was HOA officer Sunglasses, the man who had demanded my ID earlier. The other? A burly guy with a clipboard, as if this was some kind of official visit. They were talking in hushed voices, but their intentions were clear. They were trying to find a way inside. I had seen enough. Without hesitation, I grabbed my badge, slid my holster into place, and made my way to the door. The second I stepped onto the porch, the motion light snapped on, bathing them in a harsh white glow. They froze. Caught. I could see the realization creeping into their expressions, the slow realization that they had seriously messed up. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence drag out. Then, in the calmest voice I could muster, I said, "Care to explain why you're trespassing on my property?" They didn't answer immediately. Instead, HOA officer Sunglasses straightened his stance, feigning confidence. "We had reports of an unidentified occupant in this residence," he said. "It's HOA policy to verify all residents in the community. You failed to comply." I couldn't help but laugh. Failed to comply? I repeated. That's interesting. Because from where I'm standing, you two are the ones violating multiple trespassing laws. Burly clipboard guy shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on his clipboard. He glanced at his partner, clearly hoping for a response. HOA officer Sunglasses didn't back down. Instead, he took a bold step forward, eyes narrowing. "Sir, I'll need to see some identification before this escalates any further." That was the moment I decided I was done playing their games. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my wallet. But instead of handing over a driver's license, I flipped open my police badge. The badge that clearly read, Chief of Police. The look on their faces? Priceless. The moment I revealed my badge, a visible shift occurred in their demeanor. The once smug expressions twisted into something between panic and forced composure, their postures stiffening as if trying to reassess the situation without outright conceding defeat. I let the silence linger, watching as they scrambled internally for an escape from the hole they had just dug themselves into. HOA officer Sunglasses, his confidence flickering, attempted to recover by clearing his throat, his hand twitching near the clipboard he no longer seemed so eager to use. The other one, the burly man, swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the street as if contemplating a swift exit. But I wasn't about to let them off that easily. These two had gone too far, and I intended to make it clear that their fabricated authority meant nothing when stacked against real law enforcement. They had stepped onto my property under the illusion that their rules overpowered state law, believing their self-appointed titles gave them the right to demand identification from a lawful homeowner. It was laughable, really, but the implications of their actions ran deeper than just some power-hungry HOA board overstepping boundaries. This was harassment, a deliberate effort to intimidate and control a resident they deemed noncompliant. Their entire operation relied on fear, on homeowners too exhausted to fight back, on threats disguised as regulations, on manufactured penalties that few dared to challenge. But I wasn't just anyone. I had spent my career confronting individuals who thrived on exploitation, those who manipulated laws for their own gain, and I knew exactly how to handle people like them. I took a deliberate step forward, ensuring my presence alone made them uncomfortable. They had spent their careers bullying, but they weren't prepared to face someone immune to their tactics. I could almost see the gears turning in HOA officer Sunglasses' mind as he struggled to find a way to assert control over a situation that had already slipped beyond his grasp. He attempted to maintain his authority, forcing a stiff smile as he gestured toward the clipboard. He muttered something about standard procedures, about ensuring security within the community, but his voice lacked the confidence he had earlier. His words were flimsy, unraveling under the weight of my silence. The burly man remained tense, eyes flickering between his partner and me, likely waiting for a cue to retreat. I let them squirm for a moment longer before finally speaking, my tone steady but firm. This wasn't a request for explanations or excuses, this was a warning. I made it clear that stepping onto private property without permission wasn't just an overreach of HOA authority, it was criminal trespassing. I stated, in no uncertain terms, that if either of them returned uninvited, they would be facing more than a complaint at their next board meeting. The weight of those words settled between us, thick and undeniable, and I knew they understood the consequences. They had been exposed for what they were, pretenders, desperate to maintain control in a place where they held none. The panic in their eyes confirmed as much, but I wasn't done yet. With the efficiency of someone who had handled countless similar situations, I reached for my phone and began scrolling through my security footage. Every visit, every unauthorized attempt to enforce their fabricated laws had been recorded, stored, and timestamped. The trespassing, the bogus notices, the fabricated citations, it was all there, undeniable and damning. I turned the screen toward them, watching as their faces paled in real time. Any last remnants of bravado evaporated, replaced by the unmistakable realization that they had made a grave miscalculation. It was one thing to push their luck against residents unfamiliar with legal boundaries, but attempting to strong-arm the chief of police? That was an entirely different level of stupidity. For the first time since the encounter began, HOA officer Sunglasses faltered completely. He stammered something about a misunderstanding, about how they were simply following board instructions. But the excuse was weak, and he knew it. I didn't need to say anything else. My silence alone was a verdict they understood all too well. The burly man, sensing the inevitable, nudged his partner, an unspoken agreement passing between them. Without another word, they turned on their heels, moving quickly, their once confident strides reduced to something bordering on retreat. But as they hurried down the driveway, I knew this wasn't over. People like them didn't just walk away, not when their authority had been publicly challenged. This was only the beginning of their retaliation, and I was more than ready for it. I had seen it before, the desperate attempts to reassert control, the underhanded tactics designed to remind everyone who really held power. They weren't just going to back down. No, they were going to escalate. They would take this as a personal attack, an insult that required retribution. And I was counting on it. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood thickened. The usual patrols from HOA compliance officers increased, their vehicles passing by my house with a frequency that was anything but coincidental. Notices continued appearing, each more ludicrous than the last. Warnings about non-existent landscaping violations, fines for fabricated noise complaints, even an absurd citation for an unauthorized vehicle parked in my driveway. It was a pathetic attempt at intimidation, and if they thought they could wear me down with paperwork, they had gravely underestimated my patience. But then, something happened that confirmed what I had suspected all along. A new letter arrived, not a standard HOA notice, but something official-looking, printed on formal stationery with a legal tone. It was a summons from the HOA board, demanding my presence at a disciplinary hearing regarding multiple violations. The accusations were laughable, an absurd collection of fabricated infractions designed to paint me as a menace to the community. But the real message wasn't in the charges, it was in the timing. They were making their move, attempting to assert dominance in the only way they knew how. This wasn't about rules or regulations. It was personal. I read the document twice, feeling a slow, amused smile pull at my lips. This was their plan. A pathetic tribunal where they played judge, jury, and executioner? They thought dragging me into a kangaroo court would somehow force me to submit, that a panel of self-important board members wielding meaningless power could intimidate me into compliance. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. They had no idea that by summoning me, they had just given me the perfect opportunity to turn the tables. The summons was nothing more than a thinly veiled power play, a desperate attempt to reassert control after their authority had been publicly shattered. They had no real legal standing, no actual ability to enforce anything beyond trivial fines and empty threats, but they were clinging to the illusion of power with everything they had. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, held in the so-called HOA Community Center, a glorified clubhouse where they gathered to dictate meaningless rules to residents too exhausted to fight back. The letter was filled with formal jargon, phrases designed to sound official, words like disciplinary action, failure to comply, and potential consequences. It was laughable, really, a performance meant to intimidate, but to me, it was an invitation. They wanted a confrontation, and I was more than willing to give them one. The days leading up to the hearing were eerily quiet. The usual petty notices still appeared on my door, but the in-person confrontations had ceased. The HOA officers no longer lurked around my driveway, no sudden visits, no aggressive demands for identification. It was as if they were preparing for something bigger, something they believed would finally put an end to their problem, me. I could feel the shift, the way neighbors avoided eye contact when I passed, the whispering that stopped the moment I got too close. It was clear they had been told a version of events where I was the villain, an unruly resident refusing to follow community standards. It was an old tactic, a method used by those in power to isolate their targets, to make them appear like the unreasonable ones. But I had dealt with far worse. These people were playing checkers while I was preparing for chess. The night before the hearing, I meticulously gathered everything I needed. Every notice they had ever sent, every recorded instance of harassment, every video of their officers overstepping their authority. My security footage alone was damning enough, but the legal precedents I had researched would ensure they had no argument to stand on. If they thought this would be a trial where they sat in judgment over me, they were about to receive a very harsh reality check. I wasn't just walking into that meeting to defend myself. I was going in to dismantle their entire operation. The following evening, I arrived at the community center precisely on time, dressed in uniform. It was a calculated move. If they wanted to play the authority card, I would remind them exactly who the real authority was. The moment I stepped inside, all conversation ceased. The board members, seated behind a long table at the front of the room, stiffened at the sight of me. The rest of the attendees, a mix of homeowners and a few familiar faces from the neighborhood, sat in rows of folding chairs, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. It was clear that for many of them, This was the most interesting thing to happen in months. The board president, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and the self-importance of someone who had never faced real authority, cleared his throat and motioned for me to take a seat at the center of the room. The entire setup was designed to be intimidating. The elevated table where they sat, the singular chair positioned like a defendant on trial. They wanted me to feel like I was the one under scrutiny, but the energy in the room was shifting. The attendees had expected a nervous homeowner, someone flustered, someone unsure of themselves. Instead, they got the chief of police, standing calmly, exuding the kind of confidence that only came from years of real authority. The board president launched into a speech, his voice attempting to carry weight, but it was clear he was flustered. He recited a list of violations, each more absurd than the last, including my refusal to properly register with the HOA, my failure to comply with community security procedures, and my aggressive confrontation with board officers. The words hung in the air, meant to carry judgment, but I could see the uncertainty creeping into his expression as I remained utterly unimpressed. When he finally finished, he leaned back, smug, as if expecting me to plead my case, to defend myself like some guilty party hoping for leniency. Instead, I calmly reached into my bag and placed a thick folder on the table. The quiet rustle of paper was deafening in the otherwise silent room. Then I began. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. With measured precision, I laid out the evidence, piece by piece. I spoke about their illegal trespassing, about their baseless citations, about the harassment that went beyond mere policy enforcement and crossed into targeted intimidation. I referenced state laws they had blatantly violated, city regulations that overrode their so-called authority, and legal consequences they had either been ignorant of or arrogantly dismissed. I presented security footage of their officers attempting to access my property, of their unauthorized patrols stopping residents without cause. The tension in the room thickened with every revelation, the shift in power becoming undeniable. The board members, once so confident in their ability to control the narrative, were now visibly uncomfortable. But I wasn't done. With deliberate movements, I reached into my bag once more and produced a second folder, one containing official complaints I had filed against the HOA with both the city and state authorities. Their eyes widened as they realized what this meant. This wasn't just a resident pushing back. This was the law stepping in, a force they had no power over. The weight of their own arrogance crashed down on them in real time. The president stammered something about this being an internal matter, about how I should have handled it through proper channels, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew they had lost. And then came the final blow. I informed them that due to the numerous legal infractions committed by their officers, several of their board members were now under investigation for harassment and abuse of power. The gasps from the audience were immediate. Whispers erupted as the reality of the situation settled in. The board had spent years operating under the assumption that their control was absolute, that no one would dare challenge them. But their reign was over. They had picked the wrong person to intimidate. The silence stretched, thick with humiliation, as I calmly gathered my things. The board president, his face drained of color, sat frozen, unable to form a coherent response. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces and the crumbling remnants of their manufactured authority. This battle was over, and I had won. The fallout was immediate and far more chaotic than I had anticipated. By the time I returned home, word had already spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. The once feared HOA board had been publicly humiliated, their authority dismantled in front of an audience that had long suffered under their rule. The whispers turned into murmurs, the murmurs into full conversations. Homeowners who had spent years silently complying with absurd rules were now emboldened, questioning every fine, every restriction, every ridiculous demand that had once seemed unchallengeable. It was the kind of disruption the HOA had never encountered before, one that threatened their very foundation. I knew they wouldn't take it lightly. People like them never did. The first sign of retaliation came less than 24 hours later. It wasn't subtle. A bold, red-inked notice was taped to my door, this time in the center, stuck with an excessive amount of adhesive as if they thought sheer stubbornness could reinforce their authority. It declared my home out of compliance and listed an outrageous sum in fines, citing infractions that had either been fabricated or grossly exaggerated. The total amount? $12,000. It was laughable, a desperate, last-ditch effort to intimidate me into submission. What made it even more pathetic was the wording. Phrases like final warning and pending enforcement measures attempted to sound menacing, but I could see the cracks in their confidence. They were scrambling, panicking as they realized their grip on the community was slipping. They had relied on fear to keep people in line, and now that fear was turning against them. Ignoring the notice, I went about my day as usual, making a point to remain unfazed. But the escalation didn't stop there. Over the next 2 days, strange things began happening. My trash bins, which I had placed neatly by the curb, were suddenly missing in the morning. My mailbox, which had always been secured, was mysteriously left open, its contents scattered onto the pavement as if someone had rifled through it. My security cameras captured unfamiliar vehicles slowly circling the block, pausing just a little too long near my driveway. I wasn't an easy man to rattle, but I knew what this was, an intimidation tactic, a psychological game meant to exhaust me into compliance. They had tried legal threats, and when that failed, they had resorted to harassment. It was amateur work, sloppy and obvious. They weren't used to having to fight for control, and it showed. Then, on the third night, they made their biggest mistake yet. It was just past midnight when the motion sensors on my security system triggered an alert. I was awake instantly, instincts honed from years in law enforcement kicking in. My phone screen lit up, displaying live footage of 2 masked figures approaching my property. They weren't in HOA uniforms this time. No false pretenses, no clipboard-wielding compliance officers trying to feign authority. This was different. They were here to send a message. I moved quickly, my heart steady as I activated additional floodlights, bathing my entire front yard in harsh white light. The figures froze, caught in the open, their plan unraveling in real time. The security alarms blared, piercing through the quiet suburban night like a siren announcing their failure. The intruders hesitated, then bolted, one tripping over the curb in his rush to escape. But I had already captured everything. Their faces may have been covered, but their build, their movements, even their getaway car, it was all on camera. By the time I reviewed the footage, I already knew what needed to be done. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA board issuing fines anymore. This was criminal activity. I made the call, reporting the incident directly to my department, ensuring that this wouldn't be brushed off as a simple act of neighborhood mischief. Within minutes, patrol cars were dispatched, sweeping the area while I compiled the evidence. The footage, the tampered mailbox, the ongoing harassment, all of it pointed to a deliberate campaign of intimidation that had crossed the line into illegal retaliation. The next morning, the consequences of their actions rippled through the community. Police officers arrived at the HOA office, questioning board members and demanding records. Neighbors, now fully aware of what had been happening, began speaking up. Stories of mistreatment, of excessive fines, of threats disguised as policy enforcement came pouring out. The floodgates had been opened. What had once been an untouchable institution in the neighborhood was now under full-blown legal scrutiny. But the most satisfying moment came later that afternoon when an official cease and desist order was delivered to the HOA headquarters. A formal legal injunction, signed off by the district court, ordering an immediate halt to all enforcement actions against me pending further investigation. Their fabricated fines, their warnings, their entire charade, it was legally invalid now. The same laws they had twisted and manipulated to control residents were now being used against them. And this was only the beginning. I knew their desperation wasn't over yet. People like them never accepted defeat quietly. But what they failed to understand was that I wasn't just some homeowner fighting a petty dispute. I was law enforcement. And I wasn't going to stop until every single one of them answered for their corruption. The morning after the cease and desist order was delivered, the entire neighborhood buzzed with an energy that hadn't been there before. Whispers had turned into full-blown discussions, and the once feared HOA was now under a microscope. Homeowners who had previously kept their heads down were emboldened, their frustrations boiling over into action. Complaints flooded city offices, some detailing years of excessive fines, threats, and even forced removals from homes under false pretenses. The very foundation of the HOA's control had cracked, and now, It was only a matter of time before it collapsed entirely. I watched from my porch as a group of homeowners gathered near the community center, their voices louder than usual, their postures no longer subdued by fear. The board members must have sensed the shift too, because for the first time since I moved in, their patrols were absent. No compliance officers circling in their cars, no aggressive notices slapped onto doors. They had gone quiet, retreating into whatever bunker they believed would shield them from the consequences barreling toward them. But silence wouldn't save them now. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was an investigator from the city's Fraud and Ethics Division, someone I had worked with before on corruption cases. He informed me that the reports against the HOA had uncovered something even worse than expected. Their fabricated fines, their intimidation tactics, those were just surface-level problems. The real issue? Financial fraud. The board had been inflating violation fees and siphoning off a portion of the money for personal use. It had been subtle, hidden under vague administrative costs and redirected payments, but the numbers didn't lie. They had been stealing from the very people they claimed to protect. And now, the law was coming for them. By the time the police arrived with warrants, the HOA board had already begun to fracture. Some members, realizing the walls were closing in, had quietly started resigning, hoping to distance themselves from the mess. Others, the ones who had relished their power the most, were still clinging to whatever delusions they had left, convinced they could talk their way out of it. But when the officers walked into the community center and began collecting evidence, confiscating documents, and escorting key members out in handcuffs, it became clear that this was the end of their reign. The once untouchable board was now exposed, their corruption laid bare for everyone to see. The sight of their downfall was something I would never forget. The smug expressions were gone, replaced by shock, humiliation, and, in some cases, genuine fear. HOA officer Sunglasses, the same man who had demanded to see my ID at my own home, was among those let out by law enforcement. He looked smaller now, stripped of the fake authority he had once wielded so confidently. The burly clipboard guy wasn't far behind, his head down, his bravado gone. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, but the reality of their situation was sinking in fast. As the news of their arrests spread, the neighborhood erupted into something I could only describe as relief. People who had been victims of their harassment for years finally felt free. Conversations that had once been held in hushed tones were now spoken loudly. Stories poured out. Residents who had been fined for imaginary violations, elderly homeowners forced into legal battles over nonsense regulations, families threatened with foreclosure for daring to question the board's authority. The HOA had ruled through fear, but now, that fear had turned against them. Over the next few weeks, the aftermath unfolded like a domino effect. With the board dissolved and its remaining members facing legal scrutiny, the HOA itself began to crumble. Residents banded together to dissolve the association entirely, voting to remove its control over the community. What had once been a rigid, overregulated neighborhood was now free from its grasp. The power that had been abused for so long was officially gone. No more absurd fines, no more intrusive patrols, no more fabricated authority. The nightmare was over. As for me, I stayed. I had moved into this neighborhood because I believed it could be a home, and now, it finally felt like one. No longer a place dictated by power-hungry enforcers, but a community that had stood up against corruption and won. Neighbors who had once been wary now greeted each other without hesitation, no longer worried about HOA spies lurking around the corner. The transformation was undeniable, and as I stood on my porch, watching as families gathered in their yards, children played freely, and people finally lived without fear of punishment over minor infractions, I knew one thing for certain. They had picked the wrong person to mess with.